The millionaire lounged in his expansive office, the kind of space that screamed opulence without even trying. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a cityscape glittering in the late afternoon sun. Skyscrapers reflecting golden light that danced across the polished marble floors. A soft breeze slipped through the partially open window, carrying with it the faint hum of traffic and the distant chatter of people who lived ordinary lives far below. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, its surface worn smooth from years of use, a glass of vintage cognac balanced in one hand. The amber liquid caught the sunlight, casting tiny flecks of gold on the desk beside him. He swirled it lazily, watching the reflections move, enjoying the sensation of power and control that came with every sip. Across from him stood a young man, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped nervously in front of him. There was a tremor in his fingers, a hesitation in the way he held the small card he had brought. But his eyes were steady, almost painfully earnest. "I just want to see my account," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of fear, hope, and insistence. The millionaire's brow lifted, and then he laughed. The sound was deep and resonant, filling the room with a sense of amusement so profound that it seemed to echo off the walls. He laughed not out of cruelty, but because the statement struck him as absurd, almost childlike. To him, the very idea of clinging to a number in a world where money could bend reality seemed laughable. He leaned back in his chair, letting his laughter roll into silence gradually, a smirk lingering on his lips. He gestured vaguely at the young man, motioning as if to dismiss the request, with the same casualness one might wave off a trivial inconvenience. The young man remained unfazed, clutching the card with a quiet persistence that only fueled the millionaire's amusement. There was something about this simplicity, this straightforward desire, that was both irritating and fascinating. In his world, he was used to complexities, negotiations, deals that spanned continents, and involved sums so vast they lost meaning. Yet here was someone, so young, asking only to see a number, a simple reflection of what he already knew, that wealth could be measured, counted, and displayed. The millionaire's gaze swept across the room, from the sleek desk to the rows of leather-bound books that lined the walls, to the abstract sculptures that adorned corners like silent sentinels. Everything screamed achievement, success, and the power that came from accumulation. And yet, the young man's request, so unadorned and direct, cut through the noise of opulence, like a knife. He could not help but chuckle again, a low, incredulous sound, not entirely dismissive, but filled with disbelief at the audacity and innocence intertwined in the simple words. "You just want to see your account?" he murmured to himself, shaking his head, the glass of cognac still poised mid-air. There was no malice, only a mixture of disbelief and amusement. As he tried to reconcile the enormity of his own world with the quiet, almost naive demand standing before him, the young man's eyes did not waver. There was no fear, no shame, only an unspoken insistence that was both humbling and strangely commanding. The millionaire took a slow sip of his cognac, letting the liquid warmth settle in his chest, and, for the first time in many years, he felt a flicker of curiosity that was genuine, not tainted by ego or expectation. He was intrigued, amused, and, against his own instincts, a little uncertain. This was not a request to be laughed at entirely, it was a challenge, disguised in simplicity, and it demanded more than he had expected from anyone in a long time. The young man's hands trembled slightly as he stepped closer, the small card he held now extended toward the millionaire with quiet determination. The office, which had been filled with the rich, ambient smell of leather, polished wood, and faint traces of the cognac, seemed to contract around them, the city noise fading into irrelevance. The millionaire watched, amused, yet intrigued, as the young man's fingers brushed over the card's edges, as if treating it with the reverence reserved for a rare artifact. There was a tension in the air, palpable and almost electric, as though the room itself held its breath, waiting to see how this encounter would unfold. "Here," the young man said, his voice steady despite the subtle shake in his hands. "I just want to see my account." The words were simple, devoid of embellishment or exaggeration, and yet there was a gravity to them that made the millionaire pause, cognac halfway to his lips. He waved his assistant over with a lazy gesture, expecting the routine display of numbers on the screen, a meaningless exercise in reassurance for someone whose understanding of wealth was still nascent. He expected a fleeting glance, a gasp of amazement, perhaps a polite thank you, and then life would continue its predictable course. The assistant moved with practiced efficiency, fingers flying across the keyboard, a series of beeps and clicks, filling the background. A large screen behind the desk flickered to life, casting a cool blue glow across the polished surfaces. The millionaire's eyes followed the numbers as they appeared, scrolling rapidly, almost indecipherably at first. Glance, he leaned back, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, still certain that the young man would be overwhelmed on him. But as the digits filled the screen, a subtle shift began to take place. What had started as an ordinary display of balances and transactions began to swell, the numbers growing in size and complexity, cascading beyond expectation. The millionaire's amusement wavered, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. He squinted, adjusting his posture, his leather chair creaking softly beneath him. Something was off, no more than off. The numbers were impossible. They were enormous, incomprehensible, beyond even the wildest imaginations of the wealthy elite. The young man stood silently, almost serenely, his eyes locked on the screen. There was no pride, no gloating, only a quiet insistence that this was his reality, and it needed no embellishment. The contrast between his composed demeanor and the absurdity of what appeared on the screen was jarring, unsettling even. The millionaire, for the first time, felt a twinge of uncertainty prick at the edges of his confidence. The room, once a sanctuary of control and certainty, now seemed to pulse with an energy that neither man could define. He tried to process the figures, scrolling through line after line, searching for an error, a glitch, anything that could explain this impossibility. But the screen was precise, methodical, and uncannily real. The young man's request, so simple in its wording, had unveiled something that challenged everything the millionaire believed about wealth, about measurement, and about power. He realized, with a mixture of disbelief and awe, that the game he thought he understood was far more complex than he had ever imagined. And as he stared at the screen, the initial laughter that had filled the room evaporated, leaving a silence that was heavy, profound, and impossible to ignore. The millionaire's laughter died in his throat as the enormity of the screen's numbers sank in. At first, he had expected to see an impressive figure, perhaps enough to elicit gasps or polite awe, but what he saw now was beyond comprehension. The digits stretched across the display like a digital constellation, each one more impossible than the last. He rubbed his eyes, blinked, and leaned forward, as if proximity could help him reconcile what his mind refused to process. The office, with its grandiose architecture, expensive furniture, and panoramic view of the city, now felt strangely confining, almost stifling, as though the numbers themselves had expanded to fill every corner of the room. The young man remained still, his posture calm, almost serene. His hands were folded in front of him, and he spoke not a word, allowing the screen to speak for itself. There was a quiet authority in the way he held himself, a confidence that seemed to radiate outward, unaffected by the millionaire's disbelief. He did not cheer, did not smile, did not demand recognition. He simply existed, a small, unassuming figure, standing against the overwhelming backdrop of impossibility. That contrast the young man's quiet composure against the surreal enormity of the numbers was disorienting. The millionaire had expected AEW, maybe even panic, but this calm defiance unsettled him far more than any spectacle could. His hands clenched the arms of his chair as he scanned the screen again, trying to detect an error, a miscalculation, or even a digital glitch. Each line, each number, confirmed what his eyes already knew. This was no mistake. The sums, the totals, the exponential figures, all meticulously accounted for, were real. The sheer scale of it pressed on him like a physical weight, and a cold knot of fear began to form in his chest. He had lived a life of abundance, surrounded by wealth and power, yet this was something entirely different. It was as if the universe itself had suddenly shifted its axis, challenging everything he had believed about ownership, value, and the nature of success. He glanced at the young man again, searching for some hint, some sign that this was a joke, a clever trick, or a fantasy spun from audacity. But the young man's expression remained unreadable, eyes steady and calm, as though he had known all along that this moment would come. There was no triumph, no glee, no malice, only the quiet assertion of reality. The millionaire realized, with a sinking recognition, that he had underestimated not just the young man, but the very concept of wealth itself. A heavy silence settled over the office, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the windows and the soft flicker of the screen. The millionaire leaned back, shoulders tense, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The amusement, the certainty, the control he had once wielded so effortlessly, all of it had evaporated. In its place was tinged with fear, a humbling awareness that some forces, some accounts, were beyond understanding, beyond ownership, and certainly beyond laughter. And as he stared at the cascading numbers, the words the young man had spoken, "Just want to see my account," replayed in his mind with an intensity he could not ignore, their simplicity now heavy with profound, unshakable truth. The millionaire sat rigid in his chair, eyes locked on the screen as though staring harder. Could somehow make the numbers shrink, disappear, or become comprehensible. He had encountered vast sums before, had wielded wealth that shaped markets and bent people to his will. Yet this was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Each digit seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, a relentless assertion of magnitude that refused to be trivialized. He clenched his fists on the arms of the chair, knuckles white against the soft leather, and exhaled slowly, trying to force reason to return to his mind. But logic faltered under the weight of impossibility, leaving him suspended in disbelief. The young man remained perfectly composed, standing quietly, his hands loosely at his sides. There was no impatience, no arrogance, no attempt to bask in the millionaire's reaction. He simply observed, the calm in his demeanor almost unnerving. The contrast between the two men could not have been called, one trembling under the shock of magnitude he had never fathomed, the other serene, almost indifferent to the very wealth that had shattered the first man's equilibrium. It was in that stillness, in the unwavering patience of the young man, that the millionaire felt the first true pangs of unease. Questions surged through his mind, unbidden and unrelenting. How could this be? How could a figure so unassuming possess or command such incomprehensible sums? Was it a trick? A loophole in the system he had long taken for granted? He felt his pulse quicken, the familiar arrogance that had carried him through decades of business dealings giving way to a gnawing uncertainty. The office, once a sanctuary of control and certainty, seemed suddenly alien. The gleaming surfaces, the expensive artwork, the panoramic view of the city, all symbols of achievement and dominion, felt hollow when juxtaposed against this quiet, staggering reality. He tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in his throat. The young man's soft repetition, "I just want to see my account," resonated differently now. No longer naive, no longer amusing. It was a statement of fact, stripped of embellishment, yet it carried weight far beyond mere numbers. There was authority in its simplicity, a quiet power that the millionaire had never learned to recognize. Because it was not the power of accumulation or influence, but of precision, of understanding, of patience. The millionaire's hands trembled slightly as he leaned forward, staring at the screen with renewed intensity, searching for flaws, errors, any hint that he might be mistaken. But the numbers were precise, methodical, undeniable. The young man had not lied, nor had he exaggerated. The account was real, tangible, and immense in a way that defied comparison. And in that moment, the millionaire felt the fragile certainty of his world crack, the foundations of his understanding shaken by a calm, unassuming presence that refused to acknowledge the awe it inspired. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself pressed down with the weight of truth. He realized, with a mixture of fear and fascination, that the young man's desires, so simple, so directed, exposed a reality he had never prepared to face. It was not just wealth that was measured here, but discipline, patience, and knowledge hidden behind quiet determination. And as he absorbed the immensity of what he was witnessing, he understood that this encounter had shifted something fundamental within him. The joke had indeed been on him, and he was only just beginning to grasp the lesson. Time seemed to slow. In the millionaire's office, the soft hum of the city beyond the windows, the faint tick of a clock on the wall, and even the subtle rustle of the young man's movements became almost imperceptible. The screen glowed with a soft, unyielding light, the numbers sprawling across it like a digital cathedral, monumental and immutable. The millionaire leaned back, shoulders tense, eyes fixed, as if willing the digits to change, to reduce themselves to something humanly imaginable. But they remained precise and overwhelming, indifferent to disbelief or desire. He felt a strange mixture of awe, fear, and a strange humility he had not experienced in decades. The young man, finally turning toward the door, did so with quiet deliberation. His movements were calm, unhurried, as though the enormity of what had been revealed required no celebration, no triumph. The millionaire noticed the subtle dignity in the way he carried himself, the kind that spoke of understanding, restraint, and quiet power. There was no boastfulness, no smirk of victory, only the clarity of someone who had achieved what was almost unimaginable. yet felt no need to parade it. The contrast was staggering. The millionaire, accustomed to being the center of control, found himself powerless in the presence of such serene authority. For the first time, he realized the depth of his own misconceptions. Wealth, he had always thought, was measured in influence, in numbers, in the ability to bend the world to one's will. But here, wealth revealed itself differently, not in ostentation or excess, but in knowledge, discipline, and the unassuming command of forces far beyond ordinary reckoning. The young man's account was not simply a balance. It was a statement of mastery over systems, of patience and calculation honed to near perfection. And the millionaire, who had thought himself untouchable, felt suddenly insignificant. He stared at the screen again, the cascading numbers reflecting off his glasses, illuminating a mixture of disbelief and introspection in his eyes. The realization settled heavily on him. He had underestimated the quiet, underestimated simplicity, underestimated the power that does not announce itself with noise or grandeur. The young man's departure left the room oddly empty, though the screens still glowed, a silent reminder of what had been revealed. The office that had once been a temple to his pride and certainty now felt like a classroom. And he, the pupil, confronted with a lesson in humility and perspective, he sank deeper into his chair, head resting against the back, hands gripping the armrests, and exhaled slowly. The laughter that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by a contemplative silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, oblivious to the quiet revolution that had just taken place inside this single office. And as he sat there, alone with the impossible numbers and the echo of the young man's simple words, "I just want to see my account," he understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that this encounter had altered him forever. The joke had been on him, indeed, and he would never again look at wealth or himself the same way.